Hi, Linnea.
Hi, Daniel, and a warm welcome to the second episode of the Watch Dealers podcast, When Time is Money. How are you doing?
I'm actually doing absolutely fantastic. The market is active at the moment, business is going well, and we're running a lot of internal training sessions. A lot of great things are happening right now, so it's a wonderful spring at the Watch Dealers.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, today I'd really like to start by asking you a question, which is actually the very same question that got O. Handleren invest into what you might call a shitstorm when it first started. And that is, are watches a good investment?
Yes, now you mention a shitstorm. That requires a bit of a short story. Back in 2016, we also had at that time a strongly rising market, and we could see that the intrinsic value of each individual watch kept increasing. And so, by definition, there had to be some kind of investment perspective in watches. And so I put together a conceptual piece, The Early Beginnings of O. Handleren Invest, and that resulted in a post on our social media where I started by introducing this investment package with 3 carefully selected watches, which I assessed would increase in value over time and could be sold at a profit to whoever ended up being our first lucky investment client. I posted that update, and I clearly remember that I was out walking my little dog, Rolex, on the beach in Saxil, just south of Aarhus, when I published the post I had prepared earlier that day. I thought to myself that it would probably get some response. Long story short, I actually sold the investment package that same evening and delivered it the next day to what now 8 years later is still our biggest investment client to this day, who also happened to be our very first. So that's kind of a funny story in itself. I think we should get into that at another time. But what's actually relevant to what we're talking about here, speaking of a shitstorm, is that I really didn't see it coming. Well, not the whole industry, but large parts of it. Competitors, collectors, watch nerds, all sorts of people were writing in my inbox within minutes after I posted this post about the investment package with these 3 watches, telling me I was completely crazy, that watches are made for their aesthetics and collectible value and not something you should speculate in, and so on and so on and so on. As I said, I must be completely crazy. And honestly, that reaction is totally fine too. But you just have to admit that things which are in high demand and highly limited often end up being a good investment over time. And that's what has later become known as collectibles. And investing in collectibles has, over time, become a more common thing worldwide. And that can be in wine, it can be in diamonds, it can be art, it can be fine cars, and last but not least, watches. And there, I could already see back in 2016, about 8 years ago, that watches perhaps also possess some extra qualities that were hard to find in the other collectibles. We then actually chose to base a business on that in the years that followed. But more about that at another time. But yes, it absolutely did not start with a pat on the back from anyone. It started with, yes, a shitstorm that basically was just about whether I was completely crazy.
So what do you think was important for this customer who bought the investment package?
Well, I was really looking forward to finding that out. I was already in contact with him while I was still out on that walk with the dog, that infamous summer evening in 2016. And I was actually really excited to find out the next day what was truly important to him, because I could immediately sense that this was not a watch nerd or anything like that. And then I go to his place. I meet with him in his home office here in Jutland, and we go through those 3 weeks together, and I very quickly realized that, as I said, he was definitely not a watch nerd. One of his first questions was the classic one, namely whether these watches had batteries in them and how that worked. And as far as I know, there are no stupid questions in our industry or any other, but it does often say a lot about whether someone is familiar with the horological world or not, when their first question about 3 Rolex watches is that one. So there were other things that were important to this person. It was about low volatility, low risk appetite, high on aesthetics, a love for physical assets, and not least the story that maybe you could become a pioneer in something that would become a new investment market, or at least had a high probability of becoming one. So those things combined were actually really, really important for this investor, whom I later got to know very, very well, and who, as I mentioned earlier, is today one of our largest investment clients. And by the way, he made over 80%, as far as I remember, on average, on these 3 watches here when he finally sold them a few years later. So it was a resounding success story, and of course also one of the main reasons why he chose to get involved at such a high level as he has done in recent years. But when it comes to buying motives and what is important, well, it's often something that we as salespeople assume we know on behalf of the customer, but we don't. We need to dare to ask the customer about it. So what is actually important is one of our first questions when we meet a new customer. And that's not just in the context of investments. It's certainly also the case with end customers, whether they come into the store or contact us online or by phone. It's really about asking what is important to you in your next watch purchase. That's often where we start, because it kind of forces the customer to explore for themselves what actually matters to them, so we get it right the first time. And there's really nothing more unfortunate than coming home with the wrong watch, the wrong investment, or the wrong gift. So we take great pride in providing that kind of advice and going on that little journey of discovery with the customer before the actual purchase takes place.
If you're looking to make a good deal when buying your watch, what criteria should you be looking at? And is it important to have both the box and papers when buying your watch? Can you talk about some of those things?
If you are, as a private individual, looking to protect your money, which must be implicit in making a good deal, well then, the condition and set of the watch just need to match the price. I think some of the best deals you can make are with older vintage watches that don't necessarily have a certificate, but maybe have a verification certificate from us or one of our colleagues in the industry. So you can't really say by definition that the complete set will always be the best deal, or that the bare watch without accessories will always be the best deal. It will always be a combination of factors. And again, that's also why I think you should seek some advice from either us or, again, our skilled colleagues here in Denmark, because there is a need for a certain level of knowledge in order to make a good deal. Because, of course, just like in any other market, there are potentially plenty of bad deals you could make out there. So make sure to get that advice. That's my absolute best advice. So in this context, I won't go too much into when there should be a certificate and when there shouldn't be. I'd much rather discuss that when we talk about the individual watches, the specific types, and the particular potential investments, if that's the angle you're coming from. But basically, it's really a question of whether the condition of the watch and, as mentioned, any accessories match the price you're paying for it. I'd much rather have a watch without a certificate from 1987 that's 40% cheaper than one with a certificate from 1987. And again, there are also exceptions where that's not necessarily always the case. But to put it briefly, there are always several factors that go hand in hand, and that's also why you should seek the necessary advice.
Can you buy with both your head and your heart?
Buying with your head in this context must be about buying something that won't make you poor over time, and maybe even makes you wealthier over time. Buying something with your heart is really a matter of there being some aesthetics, some design, and some artistic or functional value in the watch, which all come together and ignite something in you. A good proof that you can buy with both your heart and your mind and let it all come together is definitely that, even in such a lucrative market as it was a few years ago. Well, I dare say that every watch we sold in 2016, both new and pre-owned, is worth more today in 2024 than what the customer paid for it back then. And in fact, they've even outpaced inflation in every case. I can almost stand by that for, yes, over 90% of all the transactions we made in 2016. So in good times when the market is very favorable, for obvious reasons, it's easier to buy with both your heart and your head. But when you then experience a slightly tougher year like 2023 was last year, where there was also a definite price correction in the market, well, then you naturally have to think things through a bit more and be a bit more selective. Again, when it comes to advising, I really emphasize that our salespeople make sure to ask the customer what actually matters most to them. Is it the dream of owning their dream watch, or is it the investment? We can easily make both things come together even now. But I would definitely explore a bit more deeply with the customer about what is most important, whether it's one or the other factor, and based on that, find the watch that fits best.
So, what would be an example of a bad investment?
Well, what is by definition at least a bad investment? For example, Omega can actually be quite a good investment over time, even though many people don't really know that. But where Omega and Breitling, and to some extent certain other very commercial brands, stand out a bit is if you walk into a random high street store somewhere in Europe or even here in Denmark and pay full price for your Omega. Right now, as we speak, we have these Omega Ultra Deep Dive watches. Basically, they're most extreme and, in my opinion, most fascinating dive watch they've made in recent times. We have almost all the models in stock, and on Strigit they cost 108,000 or 111,000 depending on the version. And right now we're selling them for 99,900. So that's a discount of just about 20,000 or even a bit more than 20,000 kroner off the watch. So it's just common sense and simple math that if you've gone in and paid 111,000 for an item that you could get just around the corner for 99,000, then you're already quite a bit behind. And there can be plenty of other good reasons why you might want to pay full price for the watch in a beautiful boutique here at home. And I have full respect for that. So if it's about hardcore investment, then I would start by saying, well, make sure to buy the right watch at the right price in a place where both the price and the security of the transaction, as well as the transparency of the deal itself, all come together perfectly. So you can actually have your cake and eat it too, and have that sense of security from the high street store and from the established dealer, while at the same time getting the commercial, slightly more market-driven price with us, or the somewhat more competitive price with us, or with one of our competing colleagues out there who are also online-based. I would definitely recommend that, because otherwise, by definition, you're making a bad deal if you pay 20% more for the same product somewhere else.
If someone is looking for their very first Rolex watch,
yes.
What criteria should you be aware of then?
Well, again, is it a men's watch or a women's watch? For example, on the women's watch side, we often experience that the customer has been sitting online, browsing through a ton of watches and realized, wow, this 26 millimeter date just from Rolex from 1989. Well, that's actually just as cool and just as nice as this brand new 36 millimeter Rolex, because it's almost hard to tell the difference if they're in good condition, at least to the untrained eye. And there I would always be careful that you don't end up choosing a watch that's too small. Fashion, once again, dictates the smaller watches. We sell a lot of 26 millimeter watches, but as a woman, you need to have a relatively small wrist to be able to wear it. So come out and try some on before you fall too much in love. We simply experience a lot of customers who fall in love with watches, which they then meet in real life. And then it's a completely different experience. And that's also, of course, one of the reasons why we have our large flagship store in Aarhus. One of the reasons we have our office at Charlottenlund Castle is so people have the opportunity to come and see and feel. And if you live far away from those two locations, well, then you can actually, for a deposit, have us come by your home and do the presentation there without being obligated to buy the watch. And that gives the customer some freedom to sit in peace and quiet and assess whether it really was as it looked in the pictures. Because it can be really, really difficult with these small sizes, as a watch is, to judge whether it actually fits your wrist or not. Just like if it were a piece of clothing or something else where the size can vary a bit. So that's definitely something you need to be aware of before you fall in love. It's whether the size and look are actually what you're looking for, and not just something that looks nice online.
We've received a lot of great questions from our followers on both Meta and our TikTok.
I'm glad to hear that.
So I'd like to ask you some of the questions we've received.
Fire away.
There's someone who would really like to know what price range investment watches start at.
Well, then we also need to define what we mean by investment watches. If we try to leave out the watch dealers, investors, and the semi-professional investors for a moment and actually look at the regular retail end customer's watch and ask, when does an ordinary end customer make a good deal and thus a good investment? In my view, that happens if you can enjoy wearing a watch on your wrist every day. Use it, let it develop the patina it naturally gets from daily wear, and it will probably still be worth more in 5 years than it is today. then I feel that by definition, you've made a good deal while at the same time being able to enjoy your lovely watch. When it comes to the price, when or how expensive does a watch have to be before it becomes an investment watch? I wouldn't say there's any clear guideline for that. In principle, you could find an older vintage Omega from the 60s or 70s, pay €1,000 for it, and then you could easily be lucky enough to get €1,400 for it the following year. Not necessarily because it has increased in value, but maybe because you've polished the watch or otherwise given it some care or found a collector who was willing to pay more for it. So basically, it's really much more about avoiding the wrong watches and the wrong deals, as I briefly mentioned earlier, rather than necessarily having to go out and buy something very expensive before it makes sense as an investment. So the good investments and the good deals are really found throughout the entire luxury watch market, whether it's watches for €1,000 or something like a Richard Miller for 2 or 4 million kroner. So the same mechanism is actually present for the most part. The motives for buying are different. A lot of things happen throughout that price hierarchy, but the fundamental dynamics are actually present in most high-end watches, which for good reason, at €1,000 are older watches, or a newer Omega bought at the right price for 30,000 instead of 45,000 can, in principle, also turn out to be a really good investment over just a few years. So again, it's very important to figure out what it is you actually like, and based on that, seek some advice about whether, in our assessment or in our competitors' assessment, it could also turn out to be a good investment over time.
Then there's another person who really wants to know where we get our brand new Rolex watches from and how you can be sure that there is no money laundering involved in the process.
For many years, watches have been closely associated with the risk of money laundering, and that covers everything from people buying stolen goods on online platforms like eBay, Den Blå Avis, or whatever, to hearing horror stories from trusted colleagues in the industry, both at home and abroad. For us, it is extremely important that as a customer, you choose your watch dealer before you choose your watch. That means you have a certain level of trust in the people you are dealing with and transparency around the transaction. And of course, it also goes the other way for us, that we have to choose our customer before we buy the watch from the customer. We need to have some kind of relationship with the person. We have to talk to them on the phone, meet them face to face. To my knowledge, we have never ever bought a watch from a private individual in Denmark and then just sent them a cardboard box for them to send the watch back in. No, we have actually shown up at the customer's home, or the customer has come to us. We've had a conversation about the watch, its history, and based on that, our watchmaker has then examined the watch. And when the workshop is finished with it, then we transfer the amount to the customer along with various purchase documents and so on. It is always signed with NemID at our place, so we can be sure that the person really is who they claim to be. So we are quite confident in our own processes in that regard. When it comes to brand new watches, they usually come from the wider world, and they often end up in these professional dealer networks. Now we are, and have been for many years, a trusted Mondani dealer. It's this large international trading network of professional watch dealers, just like ourselves, who trade with each other daily, almost as if it were a stock exchange. And we've been members for years. And before it really became a big thing, I was literally driving hundreds of thousands of kilometers myself over several years throughout Europe to meet each dealer, shake hands, sit down and have a cup of coffee, whether it was in Turin, Italy, or in Rome, or in Berlin. Because there's that incentive in it for me, besides the fact that, of course, we want to avoid becoming part of money laundering or anything like that. But it's also important for us that we don't transfer hundreds of thousands of euros to some shady character. Because with the low margins we have in this industry, we might average around 9% on new watches, give or take, often. So we really can't afford, for 1 out of 10 times, to end up transferring hundreds of thousands of euros to someone who just runs off with the money instead of selling the watch. So it's been extremely important for us to build a very close business relationship with the vast majority of the people we deal with. And of course, we can't have equally close relationships with hundreds of dealers across Europe. And that's where these professional trading networks come into play. But to this day, we still inspect every brand new watch that arrives, as well as used ones in our workshop before we hand it over to our customers. That's extremely important to us so that we can vouch for each individual watch.
Then someone would like to know whether it's worth it, whether it's really worth buying an expensive watch as a young person.
I'm not going to interfere in how young or how old you should be when you get your first watch. We have delivered quite a few confirmation gifts over the years, and we've also supplied a number of watches to both mothers and fathers who intend to wear them themselves until the child reaches a certain age, when the child can inherit that particular watch. Compared to many other things young people can spend their money on, this is one of the few hobbies where the value remains on your wrist, and for most people is covered by their home insurance, while at the same time being quite easy to sell if you need the money later on. It can be a bit different if you go out and buy designer clothes with your money. Then I'm not sure it's necessarily worth the same 5 years later or so. So if it's about being able to enjoy your savings while they still exist, well, then I think watches are a perfect choice, because you can often end up with either a small profit or at least very close to breaking even when you cash in your savings, again, after having worn the watch for several years. In fact, we recently did a new interview with Ritzau about exactly this topic, giving watches as gifts to young people and whether young people should buy watches themselves. And of course, I'm extremely subjective in that context because of my profession, but there's no doubt that I would much rather have one of my daughters invest their money in a watch than in so many other things they could risk tying up their money in, simply because it's not a matter of consumption, but of capital preservation. In other words, a placement of funds.
Then there's someone who would like to know which watch you or we would recommend in the price range of 50 to 60,000 kroner.
Yes. I could be a bit cheeky and ask the dear listener which car one should buy for 50,000 kroner, because it's kind of the same thing. I mean, we need to go on this journey with the customer about what is important for exactly the person who wrote to you here, Linnea. Is it a 30-year-old woman buying her first or fifth watch? Is it a 70-year-old man buying his first or maybe even his last watch? And what is the intention? Are we going diving with this watch? Do we need to be able to run a marathon with it on our wrist, and does it need to withstand that? Or is it really meant to sit in a collection and be an heirloom for the next generations? Or does it need to do all of that at once? I would be extremely reluctant to say that this is the right watch for 50,000. But if you twist my arm, and if I have to take myself as an example, I'm in my early 40s, and if I had to choose a watch between 50 and 60,000 kroner, well, then I might look towards an older Rolex that's still from the modern series. That is a 6-digit Rolex, which still comes as a complete set and which is either newly serviced or you start by servicing it, so I know it's in good condition and can handle a dip in the pool on vacation. I recently acquired an Explorer 2 from 2011 myself. Actually, it's a watch with a rather funny story. This particular Explorer, and I know we'll get into it later on in another episode, but it's a watch that costs around plus or minus 60,000 kroner, and which, in my opinion, is at a price point where the investment has been made and the capital preserved, so that it will probably outperform most other options I would have for 60,000 kroner in the current market situation. So a lovely watch, 42 millimeters of pure steel, can handle some patina, some scratches, some hairlines, and a few dings. In my opinion, it's one of the few watches that actually gets cooler and cooler the more of a beating it takes, because after all, it's an explorer watch, built more for going on expeditions in caves and who knows where else than for sitting in an office, so it can really handle just about anything. And it's not as cosmetically sensitive as many other watches might be. So if I had to choose something and base it on myself and my budget, that's probably the direction I would go, because that's actually what I've done myself.
Now we have a question from one of our followers who asks why someone should choose us over our colleagues or competitors.
Yes, well, why should you choose us? At the very least, as I have often said, and as I know many of my colleagues also like to say, you should choose your watch dealer before you choose your watch. You should do business where you feel there is trust, competence, know-how, and generally just a sense of security. That is extremely important because, as with so many other transactions, there is a huge amount of trust involved when you buy your luxury watch. For us, I think it's very much about the advice we provide before the transaction, and it's very much about whether we are there for the customer after the transaction. I mean, one thing is to give the customer a great buying experience, whether that's in our store in Aarhus, at our office at Charlottenlund Castle, or privately at the customer's home. As you know, we offer personal delivery throughout all of Denmark, connected by bridges, without it costing the customer a single extra penny. We're happy to show up at the customer's private address by prior arrangement, go through the watch, adjust the bracelet, review the certificates, and have a nice, relaxed conversation about the watch. And in fact, it's only when we're sitting there together that you pay the majority of the amount. Just a deposit is required beforehand. So you have this sense of security throughout the entire process. That's definitely one of the things we've been very successful at using to differentiate ourselves from our competitors. Namely, that we have the desire, the enthusiasm, and the ability to travel all over Denmark, if not daily, then at least on a weekly basis, and ensure this very intimate experience that the product deserves. That's definitely also a strong argument. And then we are solidly owned. Our group of owners, which we'll also talk about in another context later on, I know is based on a setup where you can be quite certain that we'll still be around in 2 and 5 years. And I think that's important, both when it comes to warranties and complaints. And again, the reassurance that we're not just a flash in the pan in this industry. We were among the first in our part of the industry here at home, and I'm pretty sure we'll also be among the last to remain. So all in all, I think there are a lot of really good reasons to do business with us. But having said that, there are actually many of our competitors out there in Denmark whom I have enormous professional respect for, who are really skilled and who in some cases are a bit cheaper than we are. Quite simply because they have the option to send the watch to the customer in a cardboard box, and some people are perfectly satisfied with that, which I both understand and respect. But if you want a slightly more complete and, in my view, secure experience, then it might well be worth those last few €100 to buy the watch from us, where there are a bit higher costs involved, but in return, I think you get a different level of service.
The last question I'd like to ask you today is, which watch are you wearing?
Today, I'm wearing a Sky Dweller with a chocolate dial in the discontinued version on Oysterflex. I absolutely love gold watches, but you can get a little bit tired of the weight of it because, as you know, the density is completely different in gold than it is in steel or titanium for that matter. And it became quite heavy, and I think Rolex has done an amazing job making a large gold watch. Specifically, this Sky Dweller in rose gold, in 18 karat Everose gold. But with this Oysterflex, it means that it's not so overwhelming to wear in the autumn. It's not called autumn heat. In the spring heat, summer heat, and especially these days when I'm traveling a lot, it's really wonderful to have this Oysterflex bracelet, which is actually what it is. People think it's a strap because it's actually made from a kind of rubber, but it's actually a bracelet because there are different materials running inside the bracelet, which help both to reinforce it and ensure comfort. And I could talk about that for a long time. The long and short of it is that this Sky Dweller, which is actually the most complex movement Rolex has ever produced, is truly unique. And having that aesthetic and the prestige of the gold, while at the same time you get the sporty feel from the Oysterflex, I think is absolutely fantastic. So that ended up being today's watch.
Thank you so much for listening. That was simply all we had time to talk about in this episode. But remember to follow us on our social media so you can stay updated on when the next episode comes out. Thanks for today.